So with that, as you know that this meeting is being recorded, thank you again for joining us today. We're a small group, but a growing group, and in hearing, and something that we've all been a part of as pastors, as lay leaders, that care in that pastoral capacity, in that pastoral role, that care and that love for care is what strengthens and brings us out. So thank you to Pastor Daranne Harris for sharing and asking us questions to think of that care and that compassion in that care and what drives that care. So thank you, Daranne, for being here with us, for helping us think, helping us speak, and nurturing and nourishing us for as we go forward to serve and to care as well. And as we begin, just a brief reading and a prayer from our Pastoral Care ELW book. And the reading is from Hebrews chapter 4, beginning with verse 14. That is why we have a great high priest who has gone to heaven, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us cling to him and never stop trusting him. This high priest of ours understands our weakness, for he faced all of the same temptations we do, yet he did not sin. So let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we receive God's mercy, and we will find grace to help us when we need it. And let us pray. God, our refuge and our strength, our present help in time of trouble, care for any and all who tend to the needs. Give us grace as we come to hear and learn again. You are the compassionate God. Support us. Strengthen all those who reach out in love, concern, and prayer for the sick and the distressed. As we listen and learn and engage in conversation, bless our words, bless the love for care that you instill in us. Fill us with your spirit that we may be empowered and encouraged to care compassionately. In Christ's holy and gracious name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Over onto you, Pastor Daranne.
Thank you. Well, it is just wonderful to be with you folks. I'm just going to get my screen switched around here so I can see as many people as possible, and the slides too. So it has been just a really fascinating part of the journey to think about how my exploration sort of in the scientific world of my PhD in the Faculty of Nursing, how it echoes, reflects, responds to sort of this history and experience I bring as a person of faith and as a pastor that has been responsible for those pastoral care components, those teaching components that those roles that we play, those roles that we serve in as pastors. And for me, one of the kind of cool parts has really been to see this dynamism of compassion and how it really is truly a reflection of the dynamism of God, of the interplay of God between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so when I think about sort of that Trinitarian nature, I see that reflected in compassion as well. And so as I present some material to you today, I want you to keep that in mind. And then when we have some conversation later, I'm curious what threads you want to pull out of the pieces that I've shared and how we reflect on them, perhaps theologically, with our kind of a theological mind. And I'm curious how we maybe share similar points of view or how you might have something different to offer to us as a group. I bring a piece of knowledge here, but many of us bring this great body of experience that informs this conversation around compassion. So when we think about compassion Compassion is really this virtuous act of transformation for the brokenness of our world. So it is phrased in many different ways, whether you're talking to a scientist or a Buddhist or a Christian, but really the key pieces in this phrase are this idea that it comes from this place of virtue. So I believe that compassion is inherent within each of us, that it is seated in us, and we nurture that and it grows, and then it comes out of us. So it is expressed in some way. Compassion has this action component to it. And so it's not just about thinking good things, but it really is a set of actions, or an action that is paired with other actions that creates transformation in the world. So it's action that does something, that makes change. And compassion only focuses on the alleviation or amelioration of suffering. So we're going to talk a little bit later about the differences between sympathy, compassion, and empathy. And this key piece is that compassion only happens in the face of suffering. So we really do not offer compassion to be good, but playing on this piece of suffering, we offer it because there is suffering in our world. So if there was no suffering in our world, we would have no need for compassion. And yet we know that we do have suffering, all different kinds of suffering in our world. And thus there is this great need, this urgency for compassion in our midst. When I talk about compassion, we often think about one of the three flows of compassion. And so that is the flow of compassion from me for someone else. So compassion from me for someone who is suffering. So it's a self-other relationship. The next flow of compassion that is getting certainly some play in our popular culture as we think about self-care and that sort of thing is this idea of self-compassion. And this is really the flow from ourself to respond to our own suffering. And so we have resources within ourselves that can respond to, notice and respond to the suffering that we experience as individuals. So it's kind of an internal process, sort of self to self. And then there's also this third flow of compassion, which we often don't pay any attention to. And it is really receiving compassion from others. So we're not always the actor. We're not always the one who is offering compassion to others. But just as we do that for others, we can receive the compassion of others directed towards us in our own suffering. So we have sort of two ways of sending out compassion into the world, and we have two ways of receiving compassion in the world. And one of those is really this internal process that we call self-compassion. So when we think about this idea of compassion for others, and I realized I copied my slide and I didn't change the small text on this. So ignore the small text, but really to talk about compassion for others. This is really the idea of noticing what's going on around us and responding to that in some way. So it's using what we have to alleviate the suffering of others in our midst. And this is where we start to distinguish between these ideas of sympathy, empathy, and compassion. So oftentimes in the English language, we use these synonymously. You know, I know that when someone would die, what would my mom do? She had this drawer in our china cabinet. She'd get out a sympathy card and she would send it to the people who were grieving. And that was really meant to be an act of solidarity. I'm with you. I'm thinking of you. You're not alone. And, you know, we call those sympathy cards. When in fact, in kind of our modern day language, and especially when you look at this concept of compassion within healthcare, sympathy has really become a term that's equated with pity. And so it's often seen as having a difference in power or a power differential. And so when I think about that expression of pity, in my experiences in long-term care, this was most pronounced when you would be talking to someone who had lost some of their physical mobility, or perhaps they had, you know, an onset of dementia, and so their mental capabilities were different than you and I. And in those circumstances, the person who was speaking to this resident, sometimes they treated them with pity instead of compassion because they talked down to them, or they were sort of patronizing in the sense that, you know, kind of, too bad for you, you're not as capable, as productive as you once were. And so they were maybe trying to be compassionate, but in fact, they were showing sympathy or pity for the person rather than really kind of this equal footing of I see you suffering and I'm with you in that suffering. I don't pity you, but I care for you and I want to transform that suffering in some way. So empathy moves a little bit beyond that. And empathy is really a neural process. We call it empathic mirroring. And so what that is when I see you suffering, I also sort of experience that suffering in some way. And I mirror how you are in that moment. And this can happen in both times of suffering and also times of joy. So again, you know how I said compassion only happened in times of suffering? Empathy can happen in everything that we do. A really cool trick, if you're looking to kind of play around with empathic mirroring, is to yawn at your dog, because dogs actually have this same empathic mirroring ability. And so when you yawn at your dog will very often yawn back at you. And likewise, if I was to yawn even at you through Zoom, some of you would yawn back at me. And it's this idea of having this empathic connection, this empathic mirroring that is just a brain process, right? In our bodies, a natural brain process. And so empathy allows us to really tap into how another person is feeling. So oftentimes a phrase used with empathy is this idea of walk a mile in someone else's shoes, right? Feel what it's like to walk in their shoes, feel what it is like to be like them. The challenge with empathy is oftentimes there is a disconnect between feeling and then responding appropriately. Compassion really takes that and responds with wisdom. And so I'll kind of differentiate the three of you through sort of a metaphor or a story. So Brian, you remember your days in Canada, so I think you'll be able to relate to this idea of ice on a pond. So you're out for a walk on a winter's day and you notice someone has fallen through the ice in the pond. So the pity response would be, oh, wow, that's really too bad that you fell through the ice. That would be cold in there. And, oh, you know, maybe you shouldn't have been walking out on the ice. And so you notice that something is wrong. There's a disconnect, but you're kind of a little bit indifferent and you kind of keep walking. You're not pulled into the moment in the same way. And so that is sort of a sympathetic response. The empathy response would be you're walking by the pond, you notice someone's in the water, you're thinking, oh my goodness, it's terrible that you're in the water, and you jump right into the pond with them and you're trying to get them out of the water, and now you're both wet and you're both cold. And you know that in situations where people are in distress in the water, the person rescuing often has a high chance of drowning as well because of the way there's distress and struggle. And so the empathic response actually puts you in danger too, right? Because it's not a wisdom response. And then you finally get to the shore and you're soaking wet and you're exhausted from the struggle. And so you really don't have the capacity to go on your journey. You have to get home to safety. You have to get dried off. You have to recover from that experience. The compassion response, by contrast, is really you're walking by the pond, you notice someone is in distress, and you think, I need to do something to alleviate your suffering, but I don't want to put myself in distress because that doesn't help either of us, right? It's not just a self-preservation thing, but it's thinking about the other person and thinking, me being in distress is not going to help you either. And so instead of jumping in the water, you grab a tree branch, you call 911 on your cell phone, you throw them a rope if you just happen to have one in your back pocket like MacGyver. I'm joking here, but you know what I mean. So it's really this wisdom response. So you want to alleviate that suffering, but you have to do it in a way that you have a greater chance of success for both the person you're helping without putting yourself in distress that could also be harming. And then instead of just having one person in distress, you have two. So that's kind of the key difference between sort of those three stages. They're all interrelated, but you can see how they go in different directions. So when we think about the scope of compassion, there's a couple of ways that people talk about this. And so the first piece that I'm going to share with you is kind of a psychological understanding of compassion processes in us as human beings. And then the next slide that I'm going to share with you is a particular model that we use in healthcare, but I think it really applies to our work as caregivers within the church, as caregivers that are responsible for people and have a professional relationship with people. And we also then get some feedback from the people that we're looking to help in their moments of suffering. And so really, compassion as a psychological process is sort of a 5-stage process. And you can see how the sympathy, empathy, and compassion piece fit together here in these stages, that they become deeper expressions of one another. So it starts with really having an awareness. So you need to notice what is going on around you. And when I think about this eyes up, having awareness, I often harken back to Martin Luther's idea of sin, right? Of being curved in on yourself. And when you're curved in on yourself, you're not paying attention to anyone but you, right? And you don't notice what's going on around you. But if you are in this state of kind of forgiveness, of mercy, of outward looking, of serving others, and your eyes are up, right? And you're noticing those around you. And so that is what we are called to, right? In our baptism, to have our eyes up, to be looking out around us and how we can be, vessels of love and light, of mercy, of forgiveness in our world. So this is this piece of having awareness, and that's where it really begins. And then you can see things, but there's a difference between seeing something and being moved by it. And so when you are moved by something, it stirs something into you. There's a bit of a connection that happens in that moment. And so that becomes, you're moving deeper into this process. And then when you notice that and you have that movement in yourself, that emotional movement, that something is not right here, something needs to change, that sense of kind of urgency moves into this wishing to see relief. So not only something needs to happen, but things need to change. So this is not where this person needs to be. This is not where I need to be. This is not where I desire to be. This is not where they desire to be. And so there's this hope for transformation, this wishing to really see relief, because we're talking about moments of suffering, of course. And then there is this readiness to help piece. And this is really where it changes from empathy into compassion, because that readiness to help is really about appropriate agency. It's about appropriate skills, resources. And so we have, all different toolkits of skills and resources. Each of us has a different toolkit as pastors, as people of faith, as school teachers, as nurses. We have different toolkits, but oftentimes some of those tools are shared. And so that toolkit really allows us to have resources that enable our helping, right? And so resources of time, of money, of a particular skill set. And then the really interesting thing about compassion, and this is something that is often not thought of as part of that psychological process, but it is that compassion is rewarding. And so when I see someone in distress, I'm able to respond in a meaningful way, an appropriate way. It feels good. And when something feels good, you want to do it again. And so not unlike when we eat potato chips and you eat one and you're like, that's really tasty, I'd like another one. That Pringles commercial, you can't just eat one, but you want to have another one because there's a reward thing happening in your brain. There's a positive chemical, a neurochemical release that says, hey, that was good. Whatever you just did, do that again, because that feels really good in your body. And so compassion works that way too, which is a direct refute to this idea of compassion fatigue. And so it doesn't mean that expressions of burnout, of feeling exhausted and tired, it doesn't dismiss those or minimize those, but it makes us dig in a little further to say, is it the caring act that is causing that? Is it that act of compassion, of transformation that is really tiring me out and burning me out? Or is it a disconnect in the agency? So I'm being called to something that I do not have the resources for. And that might be that I don't have enough time to respond to all the demands of caring from me. It's not actually the caring that is, but it's the disconnect of the caring needed and the time we have available. It might be that we don't have joy in our work anymore. And so that reward center is sort of off balance. And so we don't want to use a term like compassion fatigue, which makes us think that compassion is what tires us out. But we want to think about it's the empathic distress or the agency disconnect that can be individual or systemic that is really causing those circumstances of disengagement, of being tired, those things that we sometimes group together in this idea of burnout, which is a very real concern for people in caring or helping professions. But in fact, compassion catalyzes this upward spiral when we have a proper alignment of agency and the suffering around us. And another thing to remember here is that I like to think of compassion as building a bridge. So none of us are Jesus, right? We are not the one Savior, but we are reflections of that. And so instead of having to build a whole bridge over sort of a gap of suffering in our life or someone else's life, I like to think that we each have a wheelbarrow of bricks that are a reflection of our agency. And I will put down one brick, and someone else will put down another brick. An individual will have a brick themselves. And together we build this bridge of compassion over the chasm or gap of suffering. And so that alleviates this need to say, I need to make a whole difference. I need to solve this whole problem. But what is the piece that I can do? And that helps us to then start that sense of reward of I did something that I was able to do, and it helped in this small little way even, right? That is still significant, still building that bridge. And you don't need to feel defeated, which then starts to kind of move us into that empathic distress sphere. So we want to think about the reward, where it feels good, where we can make a difference, put our energy there, and that makes this upward spiral continue to generate with this positive reward center activation in our physiological brains. So from that psychological model, we have other models that are put into practice. And so this particular model is called the Healthcare Provider Compassion Model. It was developed by Dr. Shane Sinclair at the University of Calgary, who happens to be my doctoral supervisor. And so this is the model that we use in my research. And so really, it is about bringing together these two spheres, and that is the healthcare provider and the patient, right? So compassion is always in relationship with something else. And so in this case, it's provider patient. In ourselves, it is self and self, right? Those two selves kind of in conversation with each other, but it's always relational. It's the coming together of these actor and receiver. And so it really begins with this virtuous intent, these personal qualities that, there are virtues that are seated in us, which really spark this presence, how we show up in relationship, and then the intention that we bring to that relationship. And so these sort of feed into the model. And the magic really happens in the center, where these two pieces come together, that overlap in the Venn diagram. And in that center, we have these three kind of intertwined pieces that are really compassion unfolding. And so it really is about coming to know the person. And so you want to understand them. There's empathy pieces in that, of course, right? And so that really is about engaging the patient in a sensitive manner. And so engaging your parishioner in a sensitive manner. Seeing that person as a person, not just the thing that is wrong, right? Not just the disease progression, not just the divorce that is happening in their life, not just, this struggle with addiction, but it is really seeing the person as a person, and what are their hopes and dreams, and what was their story before, what is their story now, what are their hopes for the future? And then really accepting that person where they're at. And so much about compassion is about reserving judgment. So we are not kind of laying our own frame over that, but really, how is this affecting this person in this moment? And really having that coming to know them in that space. And then as you come to know someone, it allows relationship to really spark and thrive. And this is really then about forging a healing alliance. And so it's about being present. It's about having this relational communication with one another. There is this kind of therapeutic relationship. You have certain tools and knowledge that you can offer, some wisdom perhaps from past experience, or kind of training that you have undertaken as a caregiver. And then really it too leads to this in-depth understanding of the person. And so you're not assuming what it would be like, but you actually know. And there becomes this interplay of relationship. There's a vulnerability for us as caregivers to sometimes share a little bit of ourselves that helps to create that understanding and that mutuality in this, that it isn't this power dynamic of I'm the expert, I'm the one that has it all together, and you're the one in need, but there can actually be this really coming together in relationship. Because we all have vulnerabilities, right? None of us have it all together. We might have it together in this sphere for this moment, but there will be other times when we too are suffering and share kind of that common humanity with one another. And then when these pieces kind of weave together in relationship, this is really where we are then enabled and can move into this amelioration of suffering, this alleviating of suffering. And this happens by discerning the needs of the one that we are interacting with, providing emotional and existential support, right? And that is where we really have an expertise. What does hope look like in this moment? And it's not a false hope, but it is really the depth of our understanding, and what do we really believe as people of faith, and where do we draw strength and courage for our journey? And then really, knowing what those needs are, and then doing what we can to alleviate those, and calling in other resources, or pointing people to other resources that can also help to use my metaphor of building the bridge. And so this is sort of the model that was developed through feedback from both healthcare providers and patients about what is important to them, and what really what characterizes compassion in sort of that healing relationship. So compassion really, like I have said, really reflects our unique gifts and agency. And I think it's really important to think about that as caregivers, to think about what can I do for someone? What do I have to offer? And what is beyond my scope? And there is no shame in referral, in saying, I don't have resources. I don't have agency for this in this moment, but here I can point you in this direction. And when we work together collaboratively, you can see how this might be easier, right? We don't need to be the lone ranger that is out there trying to do it all ourselves, but we really work in tandem and collaboration with others. And that really helps to make compassion happen. So the second flow of compassion that I talked about is this idea of self-compassion. And this is really taking all these things that we just talked about and directing them to the other, and then saying, how can I be the same for myself? It sounds simple. Say, take that over here and do it over here for yourself. And yet in my work of teaching and working through compassion with people, this is often the hardest part. It is way easier for us as leaders and caregivers to take care of other people, but to take that moment to look at ourselves and say, what is my suffering? What is my need? How can I attend to that? How can I seek resources that can be that force of compassion, those actions of compassion for myself? This is often where there is a disconnect. In the 8-week training that I teach, when they developed that program, they initially thought of it as sort of ripples in a pond, and you start with compassion for yourself, and then you move out to compassion for people that it's easy to have compassion for in the world, and then compassion for sort of neutral people in the world, and then compassion for those that you might have difficulty with. And they really ended up, when they did sort of the testing after developing this program, reversing those first two pieces. And they looked at priming compassion by having compassion for others, for those that it's easy to have compassion for. And then once that was primed, then you could look and say, okay, now how do you do that for you? How are you treating yourself with the same kindness, care, support, and understanding that you would show to a really good friend? And oftentimes people nod their heads and they think, wow, it makes sense in my head, but I don't actually enact it in that way. And so there is this piece when we can work on compassion for ourselves. And really, it's about possibility. And it offers an alternative to some of the ingrained societal, psychological forces that are at play in our lives. And so too often, we easily engage in something like self-criticism. And so in this model of self-compassion developed by a woman named Dr. Kristen Neff at University of Texas, Austin, she looks at compassion as this threefold model, and she sees it as an alternative to these other forces at work in our lives. And so instead of self-criticism, she talks about self-compassion as self-kindness. Instead of self-isolation, of feeling like you're alone, you're disconnected from others, she talks about this idea of common humanity. And instead of self-absorption, she really talks about being aware, or having this mindfulness in the world. So in the sphere of self-kindness, what does that look like? Self-kindness means to be actively motivated to help ourselves, right? Just as we would want other people to be motivated for transformation, we think about how can we enact that ourselves. It's really about having an awareness and honesty about what do I need in this moment, right? How can I attend to my needs, not just the needs of those around us? And then really we respond to that unmet need for ourselves. So we don't leave them unattended, but we take action that is really compassion to help meet those needs. And sometimes we can do that for ourselves, and sometimes we need to look at resources beyond ourselves to attend to those needs for us. The next piece is this idea of common humanity, and I think this is just so foundational to who we are as people of faith. And it's the idea that we are all imperfect and lead imperfect lives, right? No one has it all together all the time. And so when you're in that circumstance, in that situation, you don't have to feel bad about that, because you're not alone in that. Other people are like that too. You're not doing something wrong. You don't need to be ashamed, but you can look at how do we work towards healing or transformation in this moment. And when we recognize that we have this common humanity, it allows for connection and relationship with others so that we don't feel alone, don't feel isolated, don't feel kind of off here to the side. But we can acknowledge our struggle, and other people can be vulnerable with us about their struggle. And together there's transformation that happens in that relationship, that shared common humanity. And the next piece is really this idea of mindfulness. And again, this is about being aware about what is happening inside of us and around us, and then noticing without judgment. And I think this connects with this beautiful idea of grace, right? That nothing you can do can make God love you more, and no circumstance that you are in can make God love you less in this moment. And to really to hold on to that, to not just have it as this flippant little phrase out there, but to have that very deep in your heart that informs how you live and move and in the world and with other people. And so these three pieces come together to create this idea of self-compassion that can be a resource for us and help us in our own healing and care. So a common piece of the conversation then is, okay, which comes first, self-compassion or compassion for others? It's the chicken and the egg kind of dilemma, right? And really, there isn't one that comes first. They come together. And so sometimes people, they start with self-compassion and they see that as resource building and restorative for themselves to be able to have compassion for others. But sometimes actually that ability to care for others, to show up for other people, and the meaning we draw from that actually helps us to be more self-compassionate too. And so we're each unique and individual, and there is no one comes before two, but rather that there is this synergy between the two. And I would actually argue that there's a synergy between the three flows of compassion. And we will, move to that. And so this is this idea of receiving compassion from others, the one that we often don't think about. And I think this is a really important conversation for the church, because we can actually be a place that models this. And this is very countercultural. This is swimming upstream. This is creating a place where people have safety, where they can be vulnerable, they can show up as themselves, their authentic selves, and they can share in this common humanity. They don't have to put on their best dress, show up as their best perfect self, but they can be this place and they can acknowledge their vulnerability, and we can create this space where we can be a community that then responds to those needs in people, right? So people show up and they're vulnerable as their imperfect self, as their authentic self, and then they're shunned or they're ignored or they're like, please don't come back, you don't fit here. Then that's been counterproductive. But if they can actually find that safety, that haven in this caring community that cultivates compassion, that can be there as people with agency and resources for others, then you create this dynamism in this togetherness that happens. And I think the church already has this community. And then it is, how do we be this community? And how do we grow this community? And how do we kind of breathe life and let the breath of life come into this community in this way? And so those are sort of the nuggets that I have to share with you. But I would really like to open up the conversation to hear some of your thoughts on, how are we this community? How are we not this community? How might we be this community more? And then any other questions you have about sort of these models and this content. And just before I stop sharing my slides, some of you already do follow me online, but I dig in deeper twice a year in my compassion course. So I've got a wait list for my fall course now. It's on my website. If you're curious about that, it's no obligation. And also, if you sign up for my email list, I send out resources periodically that might be of interest to you as leaders, of how you might enact some of this sort of in your congregations. And so just put that out there before I stop sharing my slides, catalyzingcompassion.com. So let's open it up. So what are your thoughts, and how are we this compassionate community, or how are we not? And what could we do differently? What are your questions or struggles as a leader hoping to live into this? Or maybe not hoping to live into this. Who knows? I'm assuming that you hope to live into this, but, or what are your barriers to compassion, or, you know, those kinds of things. Let's just popcorn around and.
There's just lots there, Daranne. I'm still absorbing it all, and I want to contribute in a minute, but still thinking. Really, really appreciated your that presentation and laying those things out.
You're welcome. It is maybe a bit like drinking from a fire hose. There's a lot of. I was like 25 minutes. I'm like, oh my goodness, I could do 2 hours on this. So those are just some nuggets, but there is still maybe a lot there to just digest. So feel free to just do that. That's okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dave.
Hi. Thank you for this. I feel like you and my spiritual director have been talking to each other. You've been able to put a framework or the image I have in my head is you've given me an egg carton. She gave me a bunch of eggs, and I wasn't sure how to juggle these or put them in a place without breaking a few. And primarily, I'm experiencing a transition. Where am I in terms of retirement, family, volunteering, continuing to do stuff in the church, and how do you balance the sense of call to care for others with a sense of call to look after yourself? And at one point, when you were talking about the limitations, you used the word imperfect. And that to me still is weighted as something is inadequate or is not good enough. I think it was a slip of the tongue, but because afterwards you were talking about limitations and vulnerability, and that seemed much more graceful. I'm a human being. I'm not imperfect because I'm human. In my humanity, I'm limited, and I need to accept that limitation. And that's what I'm struggling to find. So thank you for naming that clearly for me. It's untangled a bunch of knotted fish line for me for another image. That's good. Thank you.
You're welcome, David.
Throw in a comment too. As someone who's been through burnout, I really appreciated what you were talking about in terms of it's okay if all we have is this one brick, as opposed to the mindset I had prior, which was I've got to be the one to fix this. And that's one lesson that, you know, the curriculum to learn that lesson was pretty tough in terms of what's mine to carry and what isn't, and not trying to take on God's job, but leaving that in God's hands. So to still be compassionate and yet not have to fix it.
And compassion is both simple and extraordinary acts, right? Sometimes we do have an extraordinary act in us, and it is of great magnitude. And sometimes it's really simple. It's the smile. It's the squeeze of, well, when we met in person, it's just that looking in someone's eyes and that just that extra little squeeze of the hand as they're leaving worship that day, right? Is I see you, I see your hurt, I'm here for you, right? You don't even exchange a word, right? And so, you know, there's no kind of formula for compassion. It is about sort of that virtuous, that's what's seated in us, and how that kind of catalyzes our agency that we've been gifted from God and we've, you know, gathered over our years of experience. And oftentimes it is simple because we are only laying one brick. We're not paving the whole bridge, right? And so, but society sometimes has expected pastors that you have all the answers. You've got it figured out. You need to be my savior, right? Yeah. And I think we're getting better at that. I think we're training pastors differently, you know, and we're showing our humanity a bit more, perhaps, than maybe say my father-in-law's generation of pastors, right? And so, Yeah.
but also to be able to receive, to allow ourselves to receive, to allow, to be open to that same grace that we would so readily extend. Yeah.
Can you tease out for me what's happening when we get this news of Muslim families being killed, and is it possible that the only agency I have is to lend a voice that says, I'm as helpless as you are and I'm as mad as you are? It seems like there's a step. I can't fix it. I can't change it. We're finding a common humanity where maybe we can speak out and make a difference. But a shared helplessness, I guess, is what I'm talking about. I think that sometimes sharing helplessness, sharing that vulnerability is still an act of agency.
I would totally agree with you, Dave. Like,
Oh, good.
I do think that, and I would even argue that even if you can't speak out and say, this is wrong, when it is stirred in your heart and you say that little silent one-word prayer, maybe you don't even have words for it, that is an act of agency, right? And I think as people of faith, that's an incredibly powerful act of agency, that we have this gift of prayer, where we might not feel like we can do anything out in the world to make a difference, to even lay down half of a brick, but we can tap into this hopefulness for transformation that is beyond ourselves, right? And in that, there too is agency. I do lean to the idea that praying is amazing and wonderful, but you can't just sit on your hands and pray all day either, right? You need to enact prayer in the world when you can, right? When that is within your agency and your skill set. And sometimes we need to lean into discomfort to enact our agency, right? There's that growth into agency as well. So we sometimes have to leave our comfort zone. But that isn't minimizing prayer, but I don't think we can just all sit on our hands and pray and not actually take action in the world either, right? Prayer becomes action. And there's like sort of different pieces of that.
Pray and show up.
Exactly.
Okay.
And ask and listen. Too often, I think we've been conditioned to be the ones, as you were saying, Daranne, we're supposed to have the answers, as opposed to just going to someone else saying, you know what, I don't even know what to do with this. Can we fumble through this together? Because all I know is that this is so wrong.
And listening is an act of compassion, right? Giving someone space to express their suffering. Sometimes there's like the therapeutic value of just expressing your suffering, and that the listening piece is the compassion that is transformative because you create space for that, right?
Hi, this is Wendy.
Wendy.
So hi. So I'm not a leader in any capacity, but I just found the topic very interesting. I'm wondering if you could comment on where does empathy play in all this? There's so I'm in Lethbridge, and there is a big movement going on within the schools to work with a program which is called Roots of Empathy, and in which they are saying that this program is helping to address the bullying and some of those types of behaviors. So I actually, I'd like to hear where does empathy play in all of this?
For sure. So I think the starting point here is that sometimes people use the word empathy and they really mean compassion. So that's the whole challenge with synonyms, right? People will say sympathy and they really mean compassion. They will say empathy and they really mean compassion. And so empathy is a part of compassion. Certainly that ability to see another's suffering and to know what it might be like to feel what it would be like to be them. And that motivates kind of that transformation. The idea of I in situations of suffering, feeling that is not okay, right? That is not where someone wants to be. That isn't a place of meaning, of purpose, of wholeness, whatever kind of word you want to use. And again, there's listening is a part of that, right? Because someone else's wholeness might not be your idea of wholeness, right? So it's that putting yourself in their shoes. That's that empathy piece. But the problem with empathy is oftentimes it stops at that feeling piece. and it doesn't include the action that transforms, right? And that's what makes empathy compassion, when you add that action piece of transformation that allows you to kind of have this wisdom response that doesn't pull you into the suffering so that you can not have agency to do other things and that sort of thing. So I don't know if you were here, Wendy, when I talked about kind of the sympathy, empathy, compassion sort of spectrum and the pond story.
Yes,
Okay.
I was there for
Yeah.
that. I pressed the wrong button and I bounced out and I had to come back in.
That's okay.
So I may have missed some part of that.
Yeah.
There is a group here locally that is trying to pull together an interfaith network, and so it's a handful of people, and what they have decided that they will follow, that I guess is their guiding basis that they're going to be starting from, is something that is called the Charter of Compassion.
Yeah. So that's Karen Armstrong's work. And that's a great thing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So Karen Armstrong was a Roman Catholic nun. She has since left sort of the order, but she is a comparative religion scholar, and she did some really incredible work in 2002, 2003 around this global movement called the Charter for Compassion. And it really was an interfaith movement that looked at how compassion was this common golden thread that weaves through traditions, cultures, and religions in the world. And so when we start at this place of compassion, looking at, say, the golden rule expressed in these multiple traditions, Prema, I see that you have the poster up behind you on your desk there. And so it was this incredible global movement that took kind of root around the world. And so if you Google that, there's tons of resources on their website. And she's also written a book that kind of flowed out of that called the 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. And so if you're interested in kind of this from a diversity perspective, then it's a great piece to kind of dig into, that sort of thing. It has lost a little bit of steam because it sometimes didn't meet the action piece of, okay, so what do we do with this, right? How does it actually get enacted in our city? Like, we say we want to be a compassionate city, but how does that change our processes and our systems? And so some places were better at enacting that than others, and others wanted to do this, but they didn't really have kind of those pieces that stuck. When the organizers sort of lost their steam or moved away, they didn't catch on. But Sydney, Australia has an incredible movement around this Charter of Compassion. San Antonio, Texas, also really big in North America, doing this sort of thing. And so, that's awesome for Lethbridge. I think that's really great. And you're a small enough city that I think it could really kind of gather, and you have kind of these connections within the interfaith movement and that ecumenical group down there too, that you're big enough and yet you're still small enough, right? I'm excited to hear how that goes.
Okay, thank you. That's good to hear. Right now, it seems to be that they are leaning towards being more of doing social service type of things, helping out at the food bank, homelessness, that kind of stuff.
For sure. Yeah. Well, it starts there, right? I think we're kind of coming to a close, Prema, right?
We are.
Okay.
I know that we can go on in this conversation for like Daranne said, for hours, and still just only touch the nugget that is presented to us instead of. So certainly do look into the website that Pastor Daranne had in her presentation, and subscribe to the newsletter that we can continue on how do we engage in compassion. In support for each other. A lot of what stood out for me is, yes, we really want to be compassionate to someone else. And yes, we've heard, we've learned, and we're realizing that it is good to receive compassion for ourselves. There still seems to be a long way before we can have and be all right with giving ourselves compassion. So may God's peace and God's hope surround us and fill us and encourage us, empower us to be compassionate, not to just our neighbor, our friend, and our stranger, but to ourselves just as much. My children, when they my daughter was very keen on this much earlier on in school. She was taught, unless your bucket is full, you cannot give anything more from your bucket. So you're either a bucket filler or a bucket dipper. So may our buckets be full, that we may fill others' buckets as well by God's grace and God's love. And as you know, this recording will be available for later view on our Synod website under the Synod Connect tab. So if you want to refer back, if you would like to touch base and look more or refer it to someone else, that's where you would be able to get in touch with that. So thank you again to Pastor Daranne for engaging with us and opening the whole world of compassion. Again, there's so much more that we can dig into that, and I hope that this is just the start for many, many more conversations to come. Blessings on your continued. I know you mentioned that you have your oral, and I hope it's all right for me to announce it out here. So we keep Pastor Daranne in our prayers as she goes forward for her oral and as she begins her research into her ministry as well. So blessings as you go forth. May this be God's love and God's compassion for us. So thank you again for joining us. God be with you.
Thank you.